There's a river I still think about. Not the Missouri, not the Platte. A river I never saw but heard about from my grandfather, was half Ojibwe and half something else he never talked about, and who told me once that every river has a name it gave itself before men came along and wrote it different on maps. He called it the Ganga. He'd read about it somewhere, a river in India so sacred that men swore oaths on it they'd carry to the grave. Men who broke those oaths, he said, didn't die easy. I thought about that river the whole 3 weeks I was riding. I thought about it when my horse went lame outside. Laramie and I had to pay 3 times what a horse was worth from a man who could see I had no choice. I thought about it when the temperature dropped and I rode through a night. That would have killed me if I'd stopped. And I knew I couldn't stop, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant calculating the odds of what I was riding toward, and the odds weren't a thing I could afford to know. I thought about that river, and about what my grandfather said about oaths, and I kept riding. My name is Running Elk. That's the English of it. The Lakota of it sounds different in the throat, requires the throat to do something English never asks it to do, and most white men can't say it right, even when they try. So over the years I stopped correcting them, and just answered to Running Elk and left the real name for people who could hold it. I was 46 years old that autumn, chief of what remained of a band that had been larger once, and the sickness and the long, slow pressure of men moving west with papers in their pockets that said the land was theirs now. What remained was enough. 63 people on the reservation near the Standing Rock Agency in the Dakota Territory. I had a cabin, which I'd built with my own hands, and a horse I'd raised from a colt, and 2 sons who were old enough to sit on a council and young enough to still be angry about everything, which is the right age to be angry. And I had Wakion Win. Her name means Thunder Woman, and she'd been given it by her own mother because she'd come into the world during a storm and hadn't cried, just looked around. Shurpsit, her mother said, was the sign of someone who had already decided to be here and wasn't surprised by it. She was 38. She was 4 inches shorter than me and twice as stubborn. She had 2 daughters of her own from a first husband who died of fever. And she had a way of looking at a man that told him exactly what she thought of, without her saying a word. And what she thought of me, after 2 years of being my wife, was something that still caught me off guard sometimes, because I wasn't a man who'd expected to be thought well of. I'd been a war chief when I was younger. I'd done things in that time that I don't speak of now. The Army had a file on me. I knew this because a soldier told me once, drunk, not unfriendly, that there were men in Washington who'd written my name down on paper. When the wars ended, and they ended the way they always end, not with a battle, but with exhaustion and starvation and children who needed to eat, I came back to my people, and I tried to be something different, a man who kept the peace, a man who negotiated, a man who sat at tables with agents and argued for seed and tools and the small dignities that the government owed us and rarely delivered. It wasn't glorious work. It was the work of swallowing your anger and speaking carefully and watching men nod and then do nothing. But it was the work that needed doing, and I did it. Wakion Win understood this. She'd seen enough of war to know what it cost. She didn't want me glorious. She wanted me present and alive and home before dark. She had a way. When I came back from a meeting that had gone badly, when I came in with my jaw set and my hands closed at my sides, of putting a cup of something in front of me without speaking. Just that. The cup on the table, her hand near mine, but not touching it yet, waiting to see where I was. She always knew where I was, even when I didn't. That's not a small thing. A man who's been in war, who's carried certain weights, often doesn't know where he is. He knows where his body is. The inside of him, the location of himself. That gets harder. Wakion Win could find me when I was lost in there. She'd put a hand on my arm, and the rope of whatever I'd gotten tangled in would slacken a little, and I'd come back. I don't know how she did that. I never asked. Some things you don't ask about because asking might undo them. It was October when they took her. I was gone 3 days to the agency at Fort Yates, arguing with the new agent about the beef allotment, which had been cut by a third and was already not enough. The agent was a young man named Holloway, fresh from somewhere east, who had the look of a man who believed that the problems in front of him were temporary inconveniences that would resolve themselves if everyone cooperated. He had very clean fingernails. I noticed that. A man with very clean fingernails and a government desk has never had to decide which child eats today, I argued. He wrote things down. I came home. My son met me at the edge of the settlement, and the look on his face was one I had seen before. On the faces of scouts coming back from bad country, it was the look of a man who is about to hand you a weight he can't carry alone. 3 men, white men, unknown to anyone. 2 of them were later identified as working for a rancher named Corbin Fay, out of Wyoming, who had a practice of acquiring women. He would not have used that word, but that's what it was. For his operation near Cheyenne, where there was money in certain kinds of arrangements that I won't name here, but that you understand. The 3rd man was a drifter named Oles, who'd hired for the hog trip. They'd come in the early morning of the 2nd day I was gone. They'd taken Wakiyan Win from the yard beside the cabin. Her daughters had been inside and had seen it from the window. The older one, 12 years old, had run out, and the man called Oles had hit her across the face with a flat hand and told her to go back inside. She had a bruise the shape of a handprint on her cheek when I saw her. My younger son told me this, standing in the cold outside the settlement, because he knew that I needed to know it all before I went inside and saw the girls, and he was right to tell me outside, because what happened in me when I heard it, the thing that rose up through my chest and into my throat and behind my eyes, that wasn't something I could let happen in front of those children. I stood there in the cold for a moment. My son didn't speak. He knew me well enough. Then I went inside and I looked at the girls, and I was calm. I was very calm. I held the older face in my hands and looked at the bruise, and I told her she had done right by running out. I told her she was brave. I told her I was going to bring her mother home. She looked at me the way her mother looked at me sometimes. That steady look, like she was measuring whether the thing I said was true or just the thing a man says to a child. "You promise?" she said. I told her yes, and that was the oath. That was the ganga. I left before dawn the next morning. My elder son wanted to come with me. He stood in the yard and argued for it, and he was right to argue. He was young and strong and a better shot than me, though I'd never told him so. But I needed him here, with the girls. With the 63 people who were still my responsibility and who would need someone with a clear head if this went badly and I didn't come back. He didn't like it. "You're 46, he said. I know how old I am. You haven't ridden that kind of distance in." "I know," I said. "Go back inside." I had provisions for 4 days and money I'd been saving, not much, enough, and the rifle that had been with me since the wars, which I kept maintained the way you maintain a thing you never want to have to use, but understand. You might. I had a horse I trusted. I had a direction, because my son had found the tracks before the wind took them. And we knew they were heading southwest toward Wyoming. I rode. The first day was the easy day. You're still running on the heat of what happened, on the outrage, on the purpose that's so clear it burns. The miles come without effort because you're not counting them. You're just moving. My horse was fresh and the ground was hard and cold and good for riding. And by nightfall I'd covered 40 miles and I felt nothing except forward. The second day is when it becomes a different thing. Your body starts asking questions. Your hips have opinions. Cold settles into the parts of you that have old injuries. And at 46, there are parts of you that have old injuries. And the miles start costing what they actually cost. And you start calculating. You start thinking about how many days ahead of you they are. And in what condition Wakiyan Win might be. And what men like that do a woman over 3 days. And you have to stop yourself from following that thought. Because there's nothing at the end of it you can use. What you can use is the next mile. Just the next mile. I had learned that in the wars. When everything is impossible, you don't think about the impossible. You think about the thing in front of you, the one thing, and you do that. And then there's another one thing. I slept 3 hours in a draw out of the wind, wrapped in my blanket with my horse tied close, and I was back in the saddle before the sky lightened. I picked up help I didn't expect in Bismarck. There was a man there I'd known years before, a mixed-blood trader named Charlie Dupree, who moved goods between the reservations and the frontier towns, and knew everyone and was trusted by almost no one in the way that truly useful men rarely are. He was at the trading post when I rode in to ask about the men I was following. He took one look at me, trail dirty, jaw tight, eyes that must have been a certain kind of empty, and he didn't ask me what the trouble was. He asked me who. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd heard of Corbin Fay. Said the man operated out of the Platte Valley area, south of Cheyenne, had a spread about 2 days' ride west of the town itself. Said there'd been talk about him among certain people for a couple of years, the kind of talk that circulates in the places where the law doesn't reach. Trading posts, river camps, the back rooms of saloons, where men who are careful about what they do will sometimes be less careful about what they say. He drew me a rough map in the dirt, with the toe of his boot. He told me what roads I could make time on, and which ones would bog me. He told me about a livery in Cheyenne, where I could get a fresh horse if I needed one. A man he knew who wouldn't ask questions. Then he looked at me again, a long look, and he said, "Running elk. You got any kind of plan when you get there, or are you just riding?" Told him I was just riding. He nodded like that was the answer he expected. He went inside and came back with a canvas bag, dried beef, hardtack, a small bottle of something that would keep the cold off, and he handed it to me. Didn't say anything about it. I tried to pay him and he waved it off. "Get her back," he said. That was all. The horse went lame outside Laramie, right front. The ground had turned rocky, where the road curved through a dry creek bed, and I'd been pushing too hard and I knew it. Pushed anyway, because the calculations I'd been refusing to do kept doing themselves in the back of my mind, and the answer kept coming back the same. They had 4 days on me, maybe 3.5, and every hour I wasn't moving was an hour I couldn't recover. The horse came up lame, and I got down and looked at it. And it wasn't the horse's fault. None of it was the horse's fault. But I stood there in the cold with the wind coming off the mountains, and I felt something crack in me. Just for a moment, just a second. Some held thing giving way. Then I picked up the horse's hoof and looked at it properly. A stone wedged in the frog, deep. I worked it out with my knife. The horse stood quiet while I did it. That patient animal trust that horses have. And when I set the hoof down the horse, shift its weight, and blew out through its nose. Sound. Just stone bruised, probably. I walked it a 1/4 mile to check. It was moving right enough, but it wasn't going to carry me the rest of the way at the pace I needed. The man with the horses outside Laramie was a German big, red-faced, who came out onto his porch and looked at me and looked at my horse and understood the situation immediately, the way people who work with horses do. He knew I had no choice. He charged me for it. A hard number, nearly everything I had left. I paid it. I thought about the girls back home, about the older one's face, about the handprint on her cheek. I thought about Joaquin Wynn, who had put cups of hot tea in front of me when I was lost, who had found me in the dark of myself and brought me back. Paid the man. The new horse was a dun mare, with a long stride and more nerve than she looked. She and I came to an understanding in the first few miles. She wanted to go. I needed her to. And we covered the ground between Laramie and Cheyenne in a way that still strikes me as something neither of us could have done, alone. Cheyenne, I won't say I'd never been to a city, I'd been to several. But there's always a particular thing that happens when you ride into a place like that as a Lakota man, especially one who is trail-worn. and traveling alone, and visibly in a hurry. People look. Some of them look with curiosity. Some of them look with something harder. I didn't have time to spend on any of them. I found the livery Sir Charlie Dupree had told me about, a man named Stahl, big and quiet, and who did in fact not ask questions. I told him what I needed, where Corbin Fay's spread was, exactly, and how to get there without riding the main road. He thought about it for a moment, his big hands hanging at his sides, and then he told me. He also told me something else. He said there'd been a woman brought through Cheyenne 4 days ago, Lakota, going west with 3 men. He'd seen it from the livery door. He said the woman had her hands tied, and she hadn't been fighting, which he said like that meant something. And it did mean something, though not what he might have thought. Wakian Win not fighting in a situation she couldn't win was not weakness. It was intelligence. She was saving herself for the moment she could use it. That was her. That was her, exactly. I thanked Stahl. He nodded and went back inside. I rode out toward the Fay spread in the last hour of daylight and stopped in a stand of cottonwoods about a mile off. When the light gave out entirely, I didn't make a fire. I ate cold from the bag Charlie Dupree had given me, and I thought carefully about what I was riding into. Corbin Fay was not a man who operated without protection. He had money, and he had men, and he had whatever understanding he'd arrived at, with local law, which is the most reliable protection a man like that can have. What I had was a rifle, a pistol, and the particular kind of cold clarity that comes when you have already decided to do the thing, and the only question left is how. I also had the fact that whatever Fay thought he'd acquired, what he had was Wakian Win, and Wakian Win had been married to a Lakota war chief for 2 years, and before that she had survived things that I knew the edges of but not all of, and she was not what men like Fay thought when they looked at a woman and decided she was a commodity. She'd been waiting. I was sure of it. She'd been waiting and watching, and she'd be ready when something changed. I needed to be the thing that changed. In the early hours before dawn, I worked around to the back of the property, moving through the brush slow and careful, reading the layout from what the darkness would give me. The shape of the buildings against the stars, the light in one window, the sound of a man awake somewhere. A dog started up once, distant, and I went still, and it quieted. There was a structure separate from the main house, smaller, that had the feel of a holding place. No windows on the side I was approaching. One door. Heat. I'd have to be quick, and I'd have to be right. And if there was a man on the other side of that door, I'd know in the next few seconds, and after that I'd need to move faster than I'd moved in years. I was 46 years old. My hips ached from 3 weeks in the saddle. I had a bruised-footed horse and a rifle and money I'd already spent. I thought about the river, about oaths that carry to the grave, about a 12-year-old girl with a handprint on her face who had asked me if I promised. I moved to the door. She was inside. Not alone. There was a man, one of the 3, the one called Oles, asleep in a chair near the door, with a rifle across his knees, the sleep of a man who thinks he's safe. Wakian Win was awake. She was awake, and she saw me in the doorway the same instant I saw her, and her face. I have tried to find words for her face in that moment, and I haven't found them. Not in Lakota, not in English. It wasn't surprise. It was something past surprise. Something that had been waiting so long it had gone quiet. And then suddenly it wasn't quiet anymore, and it moved across her face like light across water. She didn't make a sound. She looked at the sleeping man, and then she looked at me, and she shifted very slightly where she was, and I understood. I crossed the room in 4 steps. What happened next, I'll leave at this. The man woke up. And then there was a moment, and then the moment was over. And I had his rifle, and he was on the floor, and Wakian Win was on her feet. Her wrists were raw where they'd been tied. She had a cut above her eyebrow that had scabbed over. Days old. She was wearing the same clothes she'd been wearing when she was taken, dirty now from the ride. She looked at me the way she looked at me sometimes over the cup of tea, that measuring look, and then she reached out and, her hand against the side of my face. The way you touch a thing you weren't sure you'd touch again. You found me, she said. Voice was completely steady. I didn't say anything. I covered her hand with mine for a second, just a second, and then I told her we needed to go. There are two others, she said. One's in the main house, one's outside, east side of the barn. He walks it every 2 hours. She'd been watching, 3 weeks in a stranger's power, and she'd been watching, mapping, waiting. We went out the west side. I'll spare you the next hours. They were not clean hours. There were the two other men to account for. And there was the matter of Corfin Fay himself. Came out of the main house at the wrong moment and found himself looking at a rifle, held by a man who had ridden 3 weeks and spent his last dollar, and had one very specific thing left to do before he could go home. Fay was a heavy-set man in late middle age who had the look of someone who'd rarely been told no. He stood on his porch in his nightclothes in the cold and looked at me and made a calculation. He calculated right. He went back inside. Whether he reported what happened to whatever law he had arrangements with, and whether anything came of it, I've never known, and I've decided I don't need to know. Nothing came of it in the years after, which I take as its own answer about the nature of the arrangements. We rode out of there in the dark Wakion Win on the dun mare, and me on the horse I'd borrowed from the Fay barn. I told myself I'd return sometime, and which I didn't, and I'm at peace with that. The ride back was different from the ride out. The ride out was all forward motion, all narrowed purpose. The ride back was something else, something slower in the mind, even when the body was still moving. We rode through the rest of the night and into a gray cold morning. And we didn't talk much. Not at first, because there are kinds of silence between two people that are fuller than words. And this was one of them. She rode well, she always had. She sat the mare with that economy she had, nothing wasted. And she watched the country around us, the way she'd been watching the room where they kept her. Not anxiously, just steadily, just knowing where things were. We stopped by a stream in the mid-morning and I filled the canteen, and she washed her face and her wrists with the cold water, slow and careful. And I watched her, and I thought about what it would mean to be a man who couldn't do what I'd done, to be a man who'd sat on the reservation and waited. I thought about that man, and I couldn't find him. I couldn't make him real. There was no version of me that could have done that. She looked up and caught me watching her. She didn't look away. Your sons, she said. They're all right? They are. The girls? I told her about her older daughter, about the handprint. And I watched her face do something controlled and private that I recognized as the thing she did when she was deciding how to carry something rather than letting it show. She looked at the water for a moment. She ran out, Wakian Win said. She ran out after them. She did. She nodded. Like this confirmed something about her daughter she'd already known. She'll be all right, she said. Not asking, stating. She'll be exactly all right, I said. We rode. Charlie Dupree wasn't at the trading post in Bismarck when we came through, but he'd left word with the man behind the counter. A message for running elk if he came back through. Which said only, heard you were in Cheyenne. Figured you'd be coming back north. There's food in the storeroom, back right corner, with your name on it. You don't owe me. The man behind the counter looked at Wakion Win, and then at me, and he handed me the storeroom key without comment. We ate a real meal for the first time in days, sitting on crates in Charlie Dupree's storeroom with the smell of dried goods and leather around us. I don't remember exactly what the food was. I remember the warmth of being inside, out of the wind. And I remember Wakian Win across from me in the lamplight, eating with the steady focus of a person's who'd been kept from enough that she was going to have all of this now and not apologize for it. She looked up at me at some point and saw whatever was on my face, and she said, "What?" "Nothing," I said. "You have that look." "What look?" "The one where you're thinking something you won't say." I considered that. Then I said, "I was thinking that I've done a lot of things in my life. Most of them I don't regret, and some of them I do. This is going in the first pile." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she went back to her food. But her mouth had done something at the corner. A small thing, barely visible, that I recognized. I went back to my food too. We crossed back into the Dakota Territory on a Tuesday, I think, though I'd lost track of the days in the way you do on a long ride, when the days stop being numbered and start just being the day you're in. The weather had turned. There was snow in the air, fine and dry, the first real snow of the season, and it came down sideways with a wind that leaned against you as you rode. I'd bought Wakyan Win a coat in the last town, a heavy one, too big, that she'd rolled the sleeves of. She rode with her chin tucked against the collar. We were an hour from the settlement when she said, "Running elk. Yes, you rode 3 states." I did. She was quiet for a moment. "I knew you would," she said. I didn't let myself think about it directly because I needed to think clearly, and thinking about it would've. She stopped. But I knew. I didn't say anything. The snow came sideways and the horses moved steadily through it. And I thought about all the ways a man can be needed in his life. The ways that the world makes claims on him, the work of councils and negotiations, and the long, patient, grinding work of keeping people alive, and keeping some version of dignity in place. And I thought about this one particular needing. About the fact that there was a woman riding through the snow next to me who had known, in the worst 3 weeks of her life, that I was coming. That's not nothing. That is not a small thing. That is, I have lived long enough to know this. That is nearly everything. My elder son saw us coming from half a mile off, from wherever he'd been watching, which, knowing him, was probably the high point of the ridge where you could see the road north. He came down on his horse at a run, and when he pulled up alongside us, he looked at his stepmother for a long moment, and then he looked at me, and something crossed his face. Not a word for it in English, not exactly. Something that was relief and gratitude, and something else, something about what he'd seen in me since he was a boy, what he'd decided I was. He didn't say anything. He fell in beside us and we rode the last half mile together. The girls were waiting at the cabin. The younger one came running and Wakyan Win was off the horse before I'd even stopped, down and kneeling in the snow with both girls wrapped around her, all 3 of them, making a sound that I don't have any description for. That is specifically the sound of a particular kind of pain ending. The older one, the one with the bruise, which had faded to yellow by now, broke away from her mother after a moment and looked at me. She had her mother's steadiness. She had her mother's eyes, the ones that measured and found. She came to me. She reached up and took my hand in both of hers, the way a child takes a hand that has done something the child understands was done for them, and she looked at me. "You kept your promise," she said. I said yes. She held my hand for another moment. Then she let go and went back to her mother. There's not much else to tell about that night. We were inside and it was warm and there was food, and the snow came down outside and covered everything. I sat for a long time at the table. After the children were asleep, and my sons had gone to their own cabin, and I sat with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been running on his oath for weeks and has now delivered it and can stop. Wakyan Win sat across from me with a cup of tea that she'd made for herself, and she was quiet in that way she had, present without crowding, just there. After a while she said, "You should sleep. I know, you're going to feel that ride for a month. I already do." She looked at me over the cup. Something in her face was different from what it had been before all of this. Not changed. Settled, maybe. Like a thing that had been uncertain was now certain, and she had put it somewhere permanent inside herself. "Running elk," she said. "Yes." She looked at me, that long look, and she said, "There is no one like you. Not I love you. Not thank you. Those would have been lesser things, somehow." What she said was specific to me, to this man, to who she thought I was, and it landed somewhere in my chest that had been hollow for some place that had been waiting for exactly that sentence, as if it had been built to receive it, and nothing else would fit. I didn't say anything. She got up and came around the table, and put her hand on the back of my neck, the way she sometimes did, just resting there, warm. And we stayed like that, for a while with the snow outside and the lamp burning low and the whole long ride finally behind me. My grandfather told me once that the men who swear on the Ganga swear on the whole river. Not just the water you can see, but the source, deep in the mountains, where it's cold, and it's clear and it doesn't know yet what it will carry by the time it reaches the plains. He said, an oath like that is a gift you give to the person you're swearing to, and also a gift you give to yourself. You find out what you are. 3 states, bad weather and a lame horse and a rancher who thought he could take what wasn't his. Found out what I was. I sit sometimes in the evenings now at this table. Joaquin Wynn is somewhere in the cabin, and I can hear her moving. The sound of her, particular sound of this particular woman in this specific place that I built with my own hands. And I think about that river I never saw. It's still flowing. Everything I swore on it is still true. That's enough.